When you begin a reading of the Bible, you will see God in Genesis 1 making the world and calling it good, 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 very good. So there's this refrain of good, good, good. And then in Genesis 2, you see him look at Adam and say, it is not good that you're alone, which is startling in the Hebrew poetry of early Genesis because it's like the drumbeat of good just got interrupted. And the writer, God, the Bible, is trying to tell us, pay attention here. God's saying something significant. The fall hasn't happened yet. And yet God is looking at Adam and saying, something is not good. You're alone. And that should be really startling to us because God is there, right? So to repeat, this is why it kind of sounds blasphemous at first. And I really wrestled with this and read other theologians and pastors on it to make sure I wasn't going out
Mm-hmm.
on a heretical limb here, because you can be lonely with God doesn't sound right, but
Yeah.
apparently it is right because God Himself, the Triune God, looks at Adam and says it. It's like if you're with your wife on a dinner date and you're like, this is such a great night, except that I'm so lonely. Something would be off. It's like, why are you lonely? You're together. But God is looking at Adam and saying, you're alone because Adam was made in the communal Trinitarian image of God. Thus, Adam was meant to experience God amongst other people. And we, like Adam, can't experience God the way that we are made to experience Him until we do so alongside others. And this is the beautiful moment at the end of Genesis 2 when Eve is given to Adam. And not only does Adam sing an ode to women in marriage, which is also true and also part of this, but there's now a completion to person, other people, and God, this sort of triangle that we were made for. And that is the paradise we're made for, and that's the paradise we lost in Genesis 3 when sin enters the garden and suddenly you have fig leaves hiding Adam and Eve from each other and bushes hiding them from God. And this idea that we were made to be with God amongst other people, known and fully loved, naked without shame. And that falls apart in Genesis 3, where we start hiding from other people and hiding from God. And the point of that is just to say, this explains why we are the way we are. I mean, this explains why we feel something internally right about the world when relationships are going well, because it is right. It's what we were made for. And it's why we feel like the world is falling apart when relationships aren't going well, or when we're lonely, or when there's conflict or division between the people we love and us, because something is fundamentally wrong. So my point in, made for people as the title, or saying something bold like you can be lonely with God, is to explain that theologically the Bible's setting up right at the beginning that relationships make or break life. Like they make or break life because you were made for them. And you can't understand the fallen world we live in without understanding that it's fallen relationally. And I'll forecast, I won't talk for too long here, but I'll forecast. So this is exactly why it makes so much sense when Jesus comes and puts the world back together and calls it an act of friendship, because he's coming back to fix what got broken in the garden. But I'll pause on that for a second and see if we want to dig anything more out of Genesis before we go on.
No, I mean that's really good. Yeah, I think this is an idea that I'd first come across whenever I was reading Francis Schaeffer's book on Genesis, and he talked about how we were made to have a relationship with God, but we're also physical. He also created us as physical beings, relational beings who were made to have a relationship with other people, and I just really remember that struck me, because I think that we talk about how God is all sufficient for us. And he is, but in the way that he designed us to also have community with other people.
That's right.
And so that's why right. It is okay that you can be lonely with God. It doesn't mean that God isn't sufficient for you. It doesn't mean that I think we could also point out to people how it can be. Someone might sometimes feel guilty because of their loneliness. And so therefore they think that there's something wrong with their relationship with God because, well, if I really was close enough to God, why am I still feeling this longing?
Yes. Yeah.
And so, maybe for some people listening to this, it might be freeing and helping, consoling to know that it doesn't mean there's something wrong in your relationship with God. It just means that he has these good gifts of friendships that he wants for you to
Yeah,
have. And yeah.
yeah. I, I would very much affirm that. I mean, one, just for anybody who's nervous about the idea, to make really clear, this is not because of God's lack. It's because of his good design.
Hmm.
God is it. The reason we can be lonely with God is not because he's insufficient. It's because he, as our all-powerful, perfect creator, designed us to need other people to experience him fully. So it's his instruction to us. And it's also a sign of what we were made for, which is why I want to agree, Aaron, we shouldn't feel guilt or, over loneliness as much as we should feel a signal pointing us to the life that we were made for. Not to mention, if you're an American, really, if you're a Westerner, um, the default is to be lonely. I mean, we live in a society that is structured towards individualism. So in the book, I call it the current. We live in a current of loneliness. I mean, the current of American life is to become busier, wealthier people who used to have friends.
Mm.
And I think most people that I talk to, at least in the church, don't initially resonate with the idea that they're lonely, because that word seems to connote somebody who's living alone in an apartment and doesn't see or interact with anyone. But the loneliness that public health would diagnose is not that you don't see anybody, it's that you're not known by anybody. You don't
Yeah.
have close, intimate relationships with anybody. And that, I feel, for most people who are out of the college phase, they will look back at life and realize, oh my gosh, wait, I'm in that American current. I used to have friends. Like I used to be a person who was known. And I used to be a person who hung out with other people. But now the complications of life, whether it's parenting or work or moving for a job, or it could be conflict or loss of family members, loss of friends, whatever. There are things that inexorably push us in the direction of individualism, and that is not something necessarily to feel guilty about. It's actually incredibly normal to be a person who used to have friends, but it's not something to be content with either. We need to be a church who swims against the current because God made us to live upstream. He made us to live with other people. And I think to honor his intention for the body of Christ is to say we've got to work to reclaim friendship, as a mode of living. Like, and
Mm.
I think the church
Yeah.
here has a serious opportunity for witness, actually, because
Yeah.
we live in an increasingly recognized epidemic of loneliness. So for the church to be a place where we can theologically articulate human beings were made for friendships, that's why you feel the way you do, and that's why you're falling apart the way you are. This is how we do them. I think we would be like a lighthouse to the boats out at sea, saying this is the good life, this is how to live. And that is a deep longing of mine, that the church would learn to light up the world with friendship, because it's also a lot of, in my experience of this, in my experience of life, it's also the way I see people coming to faith in America, through relationship and friendship rather than apologetics, at least in the cultural moment we're living in.
Yeah. I had the same thoughts as I was reading. Wow, what a opportunity for the church, and this needs to be a part of our apologetic, of our
Mm-hmm.
defense of the gospel and our appeal to the world of the power of the gospel is the friendships that we have. And Jesus said that clearly in the Gospel of John, that the
Yes.
world will know by our love for one another, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's got to include friendship. Um,
Yes. And
but yeah,
actually, if
yeah, go ahead.
if you don't mind me jumping in on that, I think it's actually
Hmm.
helpful to close the theological loop with Jesus, because if everything we've said is true so far, right? We were made for relationship. We lost it in the fall. America is a great example, as is the rest of history, of we are broken because we lack relationship. I mean, it's a sign of the fall to live in individualism and loneliness. Well, Jesus is the one who comes and plucks us out of that countercurrent by saying, I'm going to remake you in the image of relationship. And I don't think we can understand the centrality of friendship to our spirituality unless we look at that passage in John 15 and say, oh my gosh, Jesus is saying that he calls us friends because he's disclosed everything the Father has said to him. He's disclosed to us, i.e., vulnerability. He's opened himself up to us. in committed vulnerability because he's about to die on the cross for us. And that idea that Jesus is saying, my salvation of you is an act of friendship. I'm making myself vulnerable to you and committing to you. And that's what salvation means. That to me closes the theological loop. It's like, oh, we were made for vulnerable relationships with God and others. It's what we lost in the fall, fig leaves and bushes, is what Jesus is giving back in salvation, and it's what he's calling us to in consummation. That's the church as it's made to be, a temple, the body of Christ, where we actually come together in the midst of our sin and love each other anyway. And so to sum that up, I mean, Jesus is the God who comes and is vulnerable to us. He knows everything about us, and yet he loves us anyway. And that is my working definition of friendship in this book. Someone who knows you thoroughly, but loves you anyway. That's what a
Yeah.
covenant friend is, because that's who Jesus is. And the call of the book is to imitate Jesus, to be a friend like he's a friend. Because if we're supposed to be imitators of God from Ephesians, right? And Jesus is the archetypal friend, well, then becoming like Jesus necessarily means becoming more and more like a friend. So we are now in the heartbeat of the Christian life. It's friendship.